All right, good afternoon. Welcome to Supply Chain Now Radio. We are broadcasting live today from the supply chain capital of the country, Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Scott Luton. I'm your host for today's session. In today's live webinar, we're going to be gaining insights on procurement best practices, especially with regard to negotiation, a critical skill for today's supply chain professional. Our guest speaker today is Mr. Rod Sherkin, founder and president of ProPurchaser.com. More about Rod in just a moment. But as always, we're glad to have you with us here today on Supply Chain Now Radio. Okay, so let's tackle our ground rules first. All attendees will be on mute as we're looking to optimize the audio experience. Now, with that said, let's make it as interactive as possible. Please do submit your questions via the chat toolbar. We'll answer as many as we have time for at the conclusion of today's webinar. And finally, a PDF of today's presentation and the recording will be available in the next few days to each of our attendees. Let's take a minute to recognize our sponsors here on Supply Chain Now Radio. Big thanks to our sponsor, Apex Atlanta, which has been serving the Metro Atlanta community since 1964. Apex Atlanta is a nonprofit industry association dedicated to the supply chain management space. To learn more, visit us at apexatlanta.org. And special thanks to our sponsor, Talent Stream, a WeBank certified recruiting and staffing firm that specializes in helping organizations find top talent in the engineering, the manufacturing, and the supply chain space. To learn more, visit us at talentstreamstaffing.com. Okay, so let's introduce our speaker today, Mr. Rod Sherkin. Rod is the founder and president of ProPurchaser.com. Prior to entering cyberspace, he was a senior executive responsible for supply chain for both Pillsbury and Ball Packaging, where for 15 years he honed his negotiating skills with suppliers. And you're going to stand to benefit from that here today. Rod has spent the last 20 years sharing what he learned with other procurement professionals. I've really enjoyed our pre-webinar prep work with Rod and believe our audience is really in for a special treat here today. So with all that said, please join me in welcoming Mr. Rod Sherkin.
Well, thank you, Scott. I'd also like to welcome everyone to our webinar. I certainly hope everyone will find this event a good use of their time. Before I begin the webinar, I thought maybe do a little bit of housekeeping. There will be some handouts in this webinar. There'll be 5 of them, and you can download them into your computer at any time. I'll refer to some of them during the presentation, so you don't have to download them now. You can decide which ones you want as we go along, and we'll leave a little bit of time at the end of the webinar for people to download the handouts. Feedback. After the presentation, I'll ask for about 60 seconds of your time to ask 2 short questions, and you just need to have your mouse in your hand to answer. And your feedback is really important to us because it'll help us prioritize future initiatives. And Q&A, questions and answers, if there are questions, we'll spend a few minutes at the end of the session answering any questions that we've received during the presentation. So let's begin. This presentation is really broken into 4 areas. We call them cornerstones. The first 2 cornerstones focus on inserting cost transparency into your negotiations with suppliers, making your suppliers cost transparent. And the last 2 cornerstones focus on what to do after transparency has been established. So let's talk a little bit about the 4 cornerstones. You see them right now. The first one is called the golden rule of negotiations. We'll talk about its importance in creating cost transparency. The second cornerstone is should cost modeling and why it's such an effective tool for increasing your leverage at the negotiations table. It's really an extension of the transparency principle. And then we'll talk about converting sales reps into champions for your cause, how to motivate them so they'll want to help you achieve your negotiating goals because they'll see it in their own best interest to do so as well. And finally, we'll talk about how to make your supply chain an enduring competitive advantage by moving beyond the simple buyer-seller relationship and broadening links into your suppliers' organizations. For example, having your engineers talk to their engineers or your operations staff talking to theirs. So let's talk about the golden rule of negotiations. And before we do, I'm going to tell you a story. It's actually a true story. When I first got into supply chain, this was back in the 80s. This is before the internet, of course. I worked for Green Giant. I got this job for Pillsbury Green Giant, and it must have been 6 weeks into my job, and I got a call from the can salesman. He says, Rod, I got bad news. He said, I've got to raise the price of the cans. And I said, no, why? He says, it's not me. It's U.S. Steel. They've raised the price of the steel, and we've got to pass on some. We got a 6% increase. This is, inflation was pretty high back in the 80s. We got a 6% increase, and we've got to give you a 4% increase on your cans, and we should really charge you more, but we know this is difficult, but we can't lose money on the cans, and we're just trying to stay whole. And this was a big deal because we spent more on the cans than the corn, and it was millions of dollars worth of cans, and this is going to be a $2 or $3 million hit to our bottom line. But in the end, you really had no choice. I mean, we had to take an increase. The supplier had a really good reason. We had to have cans. I mean, can you imagine the corn ripens in the fields and there's no cans, so we had to have the cans. And we negotiated. I think we wound up with a 3 or 3.5% increase. But the point was that, we had to do it. A little while later, maybe, I don't know, a couple months later, I got a call from the corrugated supplier, the cardboard box supplier. And he had a similar song and dance. He had to raise the price of the cardboard boxes, and it wasn't his fault. It was Smurfit Stone. They had raised the price of the paper, and I can't remember, a 4% increase. I think we wound up with a 3. And a little while later, the trucker phoned, and I guess you can guess why, because the diesel had gone up. And same song and dance, same kind of negotiation. Pallets supplier phoned about 2 weeks later because the price of wood had gone up. So finally, I went to I'd only had the job for a few months. I went to my boss and I said, geez, I think we need to understand a lot more about what's happening to our suppliers' costs. I mean, it's not, knowing what can prices are or pallet prices is important, but we really need to know what the steel prices are and the wood prices. And so I wanted to, I said, there's this publication called American Metals Markets. It's still around. It was $1,100. It was a lot of money in those days. In fact, it's still a lot of money. But it was a physical magazine we got once a month, and then if you went to the third last page, you could see the transaction prices for steel. So he said, fine. Started subscribing, and after about 7 or 8 months of keeping track, we actually made this is before Excel, let alone the internet. So there was a hand graph, I remember, and after about 7 months, I noticed that the price of steel had come back down. In fact, it was about what it was before they raised the can prices. So I phoned the sales rep. I said, hey, John, I just noticed that the price of steel has come back down to where it was before you raised the can prices. Just silence. I mean, there was 30 seconds of silence, and finally he said, oh yeah, Rod, I was just about to call you. Well, we both knew it wasn't true, but the next day he called back and he rescinded the increase. And I went, oh my goodness. This is very powerful stuff. So that's kind of the origin of the golden rule. That's how I learned it anyway, the hard way. And the golden rule is never enter a negotiation without first researching what's happened to your supplier's costs. We're going to talk about why that's so important now. So here's some examples of what you can do. These are real graphs. This is the price of cold rolled steel for the last 2 years. You can see it's about $820 now. Isn't that interesting? History is repeating itself from the 80s. About 1.5 years ago, the price of steel was about the same, about $820. It started to increase. This is when the tariffs hit, the 25% tariffs. And so the price of steel went up to $1,000. But as you can see, over the last 6 months or 8 months or so, it's come back down. So if you're out there buying anything made from steel, you for sure got an increase back here. But did you get a decrease? And if you don't have a decrease, then if you send a graph like this to your supplier, to your sales rep, and said, geez, I don't understand, same thing I did with the can sales guy, there's a very powerful argument that you have for them to at least reduce the price back to it where it was about 1.5 years ago. Now, I'm making it sound like the sales reps or your suppliers are not playing fair. That's not true. It's not their job to lower their price. It's not their job. Everyone's in business to make all the money they can, just like your own company is. So it's unreasonable to expect your supplier to volunteer this kind of information. But the important thing about transparency is once you make their costs transparent, they can't take that away. They can't undo it. They don't want you to know this stuff, but once you do, they can't take it away. So a graph like this makes it very difficult for a supplier to argue, because when the costs went up, they justify the increase because their raw material costs have gone up, and the same logic applies in reverse. And unless they want to appear greedy and hypocritical and ruin their business reputation, they're going to rescind the increase because it's in their long-term business interest to do so. So there's a seal graph. So what you can do, and it basically is, as I've just said, you go back, find a point in time in the past when the price was about the same. So I've chosen September 2017. Go to your accounts payable department, find out what you were paying for the steel item you're buying, and then basically ask your supplier, why aren't I paying that right now? And it's very difficult, as I said, for them to argue. Very powerful stuff. Here's aluminum, same idea. This is a 5-year time period, and you can see it's gone up and down a few times. But lately, over the last year or two, it's a very similar pattern. The price is back down today to what it was, say, about a year and a half ago. The reason I'm showing this longer-term graph is that rather than just go back a year or two, you can go back as far as you want, and you can find a point in time back almost 5 years ago when aluminum was the same price as it is today. So you could do the same trick. You go to your accounts payable department, find out what you were paying for aluminum extrusion, an aluminum casting, whatever it is you were buying, and ask your supplier, geez, why am I paying more today than I was 4.5 years ago? Well, we all know why we're paying more today than we were 4.5 years ago, and it's something we're all familiar with. It's called price creep. Prices creep up all the time, and it's just the nature of our system. And there's two reasons for price creep. One is kind of a passive price creep. So here, let's say you were paying $10 for an aluminum extrusion back at the end of 2014, and you're still paying $10 here, you're still paying $10 here because the supplier hasn't called you. He should have called you, but of course they won't, because they're not going to tell you the cost of aluminum has gone down because you'd asked for a decrease in the part you're buying for $10. Now, if you were following this back in 2014, you could have called the supplier, but let's say you hadn't been doing that. So you're probably going to be paying $10 maybe to about here. And then what happens is you can see the price of aluminum is coming up. So your supplier might phone you and say, geez, price of aluminum's come up, from about 75 cents to about 85 or 90 cents over the last year or so, and they might ask for $11. But even if they don't do that, they're certainly going to start asking for more money in this period here because their costs are truly up. And you can see they've gone up to almost, hit about $1 up here. So you're going to be paying more than $10. You might be paying $11 or $12. And then if you come back down here, you might be paying $11 again because that's what you're paying back here. But you should be paying the $10. And the reason you're paying $11 now is you didn't get the decrease back here. So that's kind of a passive price creep. And then you've got the active price creep. So when you look at these kinds of graphs for almost any raw material, any commodity you look at, you're going to find ups and downs, you're going to find valleys and peaks. And just remember that what's really happening over time is that you're paying more than you really need to, because it's always in the supplier's advantage to ignore the periods of time when his costs go down and to capitalize on the periods of time when his costs go up. So using graphs like this can basically eliminate historical price creep. So here's an example. Again, I chose a period of time. This is February 2017 when this aluminum was about the same as it is now. But again, I could have gone back to 2015 and done the same thing. Very powerful to be able to show your sales rep that, hey, why are you charging me so much more now? And actually show them what you were paying back 3 or 4 years ago. Here's another trick. It's called choosing the time frame. This comes from the last graph, but if I look at the last year, for example, this is June 2018, you can see that the price of aluminum is down over 20%. So you could send this graph to your sales rep and say, look, I was paying you $11 for the extrusion, cost of raw material is down 20%. I would expect at least a 10 to 12% decrease because probably half to 2/3 of what you're paying for is the price of aluminum. So you can pick and choose your time slot and use these kinds of data to force your supplier to take this. What you really want to do is get the sales rep to show this to his management and start to explain why you're not going to accept a price increase, and actually start explaining your point of view. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes, how to turn your sales reps into champions for your cause, but this is kind of how you do it. This is just metals that go up and down. Here's high density polyethylene. You can see lots of room for price creep here, ups and downs. In fact, the price of polyethylene today is about the same as it was 10 years ago. So if you were, you're paying 20 cents for a plastic extrusion, plastic injection molded part 10 years ago, you've got a very powerful argument to be paying the same 20 cents today as you were 10 years ago. Now, there may be some creep in energy costs, there might be some labor that goes up, but remember, this is an injection molded plastic part, so most of what you're paying for, at least half, will be the plastic resin itself. Here's the same trick. I've basically taken about a year and a half here, went back to October of 2017, found out what I was paying for that injection molded plastic part. Plastic's down about 37% over this time period. And by the way, this is all because natural gas prices have been plummeting, and natural gas is the feedstock for polyethylene. So this all kind of makes sense. And if you don't proactively go after things like this, again, as I said, the supplier's not going to tell you, but you can use charts like this to force them to play fair. Here's copper. I'm not going to go through it all. You can see lots of room here for price creep, lots of room here for, absent, amnesia, I guess, is what the supplier might get when his costs go down. But you can see there's lots of areas here when the costs go up where they'll be raising the price. Here's diesel fuel. It isn't just raw materials. It just applies to services like transportation. You can see here that diesel fuel prices are significantly lower now than they were 5 or 6 years ago. That's because oil prices have dropped. So you should be paying less. Let's say you're paying $1,000 a truckload to move goods from your plant to your warehouse, and you were paying that, maybe $900 4 or 5 years ago. You really shouldn't be paying any more. In fact, there's a strong argument you should be paying less today than you were 3 or 4 years ago for that same shipment. Now, your supplier might come back and say, but hey, it isn't just fuel. I mean, I've got to pay my driver's wages, and that's true. They've got a good point. And it isn't just fuel, but fuel and wages are the top 2 components in the cost of running a truck. So there are data around, like this is American unit labor costs. This is an indication of what's happened to the cost of blue-collar labor in the United States over the last, this is 4 years. It's been about a 2% increase per year. Again, these are labor costs. This isn't wages. This is the cost of labor less any productivity gains. So if wages are up 3%, productivity is up 1%, then it'd be a 2% increase in the cost of labor. So again, maybe your supplier is saying, look, I need some advantage, and you could maybe give them a $20 or $30 increase on that $1,000 freight cost, but that's based on the driver's wages, not because of the fuel. Quickly, this is the last chart I'm going to show, but just to get this point across, here's hardwood pallets. Been a heck of an increase in the price of the wood that's used in returnable pallets. I'm sure anybody who buys them is paying a lot more today than they were 2 or 3 years ago. It's because it's gone from just over $300 to almost $500. But here's another little trick. By picking and choosing the right time frame, you can see that back in about April of 2015, and here we have it here, April 2015, the price peaked at $465. So instead of the increase being the difference between 300 and 500, the difference is really the difference between 465 and 500. That's only a 5% increase. So go back to your accounts payable department, find out what you were paying for pallets back in April 2015, and then you could offer your supplier a 2 or 3, perhaps a 4% increase. But don't base it on what you were paying here, base it on what you were paying here, because the increase in his raw material costs are a lot less, and you're likely to have been paying less back here. So what's the lesson here is that cost transparency works because it's based on a supplier's natural desire to preserve their good name. When I phoned the can sales rep and I said, hey, I noticed the price of steel's back down, and there was that pregnant pause for 30 seconds, he was a smart guy. That's what he was thinking about. He didn't want to sully his name. He didn't want to come across as greedy or hypocritical, because he knew that he had just phoned a few months before to get an increase based on his costs going up. So to preserve his good name, they capitulated and reduced the price, put the price back to where it was before. Cost transparency favors the buyer over the seller. That's that price creep we were talking about. If you make your supplier's cost transparent, it eliminates all the past sins. It eliminates all of the times when he didn't lower the price when the cost went down, and then raised them when his costs went up. So it favors the buyer over the seller because it eliminates price creep. And this is key. Creating cost transparency is your responsibility. You can't expect your supplier to do it. But again, once you do it, they can't take it away, and the ball's in your court. Transparency paves the way for building a robust, sustainable, low-cost supply chain, and that's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. So just before I leave the first cornerstone, remember the golden rule. Never enter a negotiation without first researching what's happened to your supplier's costs. That was first cornerstone. Here's the second cornerstone. Should cost modeling, building on transparency. So I'm going to set the stage. Things like cans are made out of one raw material. Pallets are made out of wood. But you'll often be negotiating for items made out of more than one raw material, and that's when it's often a good time to do a should cost model. And I'm going to show you how to do a should cost model, and it's not just before we start. A lot of people shy away from these. I certainly did when I first started in procurement, because it's difficult. I mean, all the different components that go into things, and how do we know what things really cost, and what about suppliers' overheads and profits, and you wind up thinking, you know, it's just a long run for a short slide. But as we go through this in the next couple of minutes, I'll show you a simplified way of doing it that's quite effective. So let's set the scene. Let's say you buy a medium-sized electric motor. Let's say that you negotiated about a year ago, say January of 2018, you're paying $230 for it. The year before, you were paying $210, so in 2017, and you're about to sit down to negotiate the price again, and your supplier's opening position is that he's going to hold the price at $230 because you're such a good customer, and because, but as long as as long as you agree not to tell anyone else, he thinks he can hold the price at $230. So is that a fair price? So let's build a should cost model for a medium-sized electric motor. So I've got a form here. You give it a name. You need a start date. Remember I said that back in 2017 you were paying $210. You're currently paying $230 as of January 2018, and we're about to renegotiate it. So there's the price we paid back in January of 2017. Then I'm going to choose some raw materials. Now this is where people are often surprised. I'm only choosing 3 raw materials here. Cold rolled steel, that's for the housing, fasteners and things. Copper, obviously there's a lot of copper in an electric motor. The windings around the armature are copper. And then there's grain-oriented electric steel. That's the rotor itself, the things that the copper is wound around. Now there are other parts to an electric motor. There's labor and transportation and things. But when you model, you really don't have to model everything. And here's the first rule. You never get a model right the first time. I've been doing this for over 20 years. I've never gotten a model right the first time. But that's not important. What's important is to put down some of the key raw materials, make some assumptions, and then show it to your supplier. You need to think of the first pass model as almost a discussion piece that you're going to show to the supplier and get their feedback. And in a way, you don't want to get it right the first time, because if you get it right the first time, then you're kind of imposing it on the supplier, whereas if you kind of get it close and you ask for their input and they come back and they make corrections and they additions, what's happened is they wind up owning the model too. It's really important psychologically that this becomes a shared activity. So by starting off with a discussion piece that you know is going to be directionally correct, but it's going to need some tweaking, getting the supplier involved, getting them to participate, you're actually getting them to own the model at the same time. So let's play this one out. So there are the 3 raw materials. There's the cold roll steel. I go back. I go to the internet. I found out it was $805 a ton back in January 2017. Copper was $2.49, and grain-oriented steel was $192. I take a guess at how much the supplier paid for the steel. Well, I can kind of look at the motor and estimate the weight of the steel, and I reckon there's $25 worth of steel he bought, $35 worth of copper, and $45 worth of electrical steel. It's more expensive. So that adds up to $105. That leaves $105 for the supplier's profit, overheads, and unknowns. So let's talk about that for a minute. When you model, you need to also model suppliers' profits, overheads, and unknowns. Some people call that gross margin, because the supplier has to cover his overheads and has to make a profit. And so what you do is you separate them out. So what the computer's done here is it just subtracted 45, 35, and 25 from the total of 210. That was on the start date. Remember, the price was 210 and left 105. So that basically says half of what I'm paying for are the raw materials that the supplier bought, and the other half is the money he needs to cover his overheads, make a profit, and for any of the unknowns, the things that I didn't include in the model. So I run this through an Excel spreadsheet. And by the way, the logic to take that data and create a spreadsheet like this is actually one of the handouts. It's called You Don't Get It Right the First Time. So if you want to download that handout, you can create your own spreadsheet that looks something like this. So there's start date. There's the $210. There's the 50%, that the $105. That's the gross margin, and those are the bars. Those stacks each represent the cold roll steel, the copper, and the electrical steel. And you can see what the model's done here. It's just basically it's held the supplier's gross margin constant. What we're really saying to the supplier is, look, we're going to respect the fact that you have to make a profit and cover your overheads, and we're not, even if we increase our volume, that's for your account. So if you do something efficient, if you add a third shift to your operations, if you invest in capital spending to reduce your costs, that's for you. We're not asking for that. We're just saying that when the raw materials go up and down, we want you to go up and down with the raw materials. We don't want you to make extra margin just because the cost of copper, the cost of steel has gone up. So you can see based on this model, it started at 210. Here's the price on January 2018. Remember, we were paying 230. And here's the price today. The price today is about 210 again. So what this is saying, this model, remember, this is the first pass model, is that we should be paying about the same today as we were 2 years ago, and certainly less than $230. So you call your sales rep, you show him the graph, you explain your assumptions. He goes, my goodness, he or she will probably take this back to their management. They're not going to be able to make a deal on the spot. And the management will say, well, look, that's not right. I mean, there's no labor here. So what often happens, and what should happen, is the supplier will come back and make corrections. We talked about that. He said, first of all, we spend more than $35 in copper. We spend $48 because it's an electrical grade copper, and you actually underestimated the amount. Grain-oriented steel is you actually had a bit too much in there. We only spent $35, but you forgot the labor, you forgot the trucking, and the big deal here is we don't use cold rolled steel, we use stainless steel, and because of corrosion issues. And we don't make $105 a motor, we make $63 a motor. We wish we made $105, so our gross margin is a lot less. So this is great. This is exactly what we wanted to happen. The supplier's taken our first pass and made the correction. So what's actually happened to the model? You run this through the Excel spreadsheet. You use your spreadsheet. You create the graph. Here's the $210 for the start date. Here's $230, which is what we're paying now. So supplier actually seems to be, pretty straightforward, straight shooting supplier. We're paying what we should pay. And instead of 210 here, it's 216. So there's still a decrease, but it's not exactly what we said. But here's the key. When we've been doing this for 20 years, whenever we've built a model and then run it through the supplier, gotten his feedback, what we find is inevitably the model changes, but it doesn't change materially. That if the model said you should be paying less today than a year ago, it will still say that. The figures will change based on the supplier's input, but the conclusions don't change. And again, because each of these raw materials, the copper, the steel, the trucking, all of these inputs would have had price creep associated with them because the suppliers wouldn't have lowered the price of the motor as the copper prices or steel prices went down. By eliminating price creep, what you're basically doing is saying to the supplier, look, I should be paying about the same today or maybe a little bit more than I did 2 years ago. I should certainly be paying less than I was last year. We expect you to charge us $216 or $17, and the supplier will inevitably, not inevitably, 99% of the time, the supplier will agree for the same reason he agreed when we talked about the transparency with the charts, is that he's going to look greedy and hypocritical if he doesn't. This is proof positive. His costs are down. You're holding his margin constant. That's the blue line here, the $63. And unless he wants to sully his reputation, he's going to agree. The other thing about these models, and this is a little bit of a bonus, that every month now you can add another bar. So you don't have to recalculate. You don't have to reconfigure the model. All you have to do is look at what's happened to the inputs. So as the copper price changes, steel, this will change automatically. You can open this model up, say 6 months from now, recalculate it. Let's say it's at $210. You go back to the supplier and say, look, it should be $210 now. In fact, it's almost like an automatic pricing mechanism. And once suppliers understand how this works and they've had a chance to become involved, it takes the hassle out of the whole price negotiating. When I was at Pillsbury, I was a Green Giant in bulk packaging. I spent half my time hassling over prices. I bet you a lot of people out there do the same. Once you've got a mechanism like this in place that's agreed to by both parties, it's fair, it respects and preserves their margin, then that hassle seems to go away. And you can focus on more productive things, and that's something we'll talk about. So you never get a model right the first time. This is one of the handouts. I'm not going to read this, but basically this is a kind of a précis of everything I've talked about. Think of the first pass as a discussion piece. Because of price creep, the model almost always calculates lower prices. Even after the supplier finishes with his inputs, you're still going to be in the driver's seat. And the corrected model means that they own it too. So once you've got these models that have been interactive, you've got two parties owning a model, and what you wind up with is a pricing mechanism that's mutually agreed to going forward. Your supplier's costs are now transparent, his margins are protected, and the hassling over price seems to disappear. And you're going to find that you and your sales rep are going to have a lot of extra time to maybe do more productive things than hassling over price. So we'll talk about that over the next few minutes. So cost transparency is the golden arrow in a procurement professional's negotiations quiver. And I think that's something that you should keep in the back of your mind as we go through the rest of this. So we've now talked about the two first cornerstones. The first one was the golden rule. The second one was should cost modeling. The third one was converting sales reps into champions for your costs. Sales reps are really your natural ally. And that's because they want to close. That's what they get paid to do. And you want to buy. You want to buy at the right price, of course. So to succeed, sales reps know they need to forge a good working relationship with their customers. Nobody wants to buy things from people they don't like or don't trust. So if you make it clear that helping you achieve your cost transparency goals helps them achieve their goals too, they're going to be very, very interested in cooperating. Remember that sales reps tend to be paid for closing, not for the price they close at. And if price is an obstacle, they'll be keen to remove it too. So if you arm your sales rep with compelling transparency data, you can make them an effective champion for your cause by having them explain your point of view to their superiors. Their management should be highly motivated to cooperate. And just to repeat, sales reps management will be motivated because, as I've said before, not agreeing to a decrease will paint them as greedy and hypocritical because in the past they justified raising prices based on higher input costs. So it's obvious that if higher input costs justify higher prices, then lower input costs justify lower ones. And preserving their company's good name is a fundamental senior management responsibility. It's key to the company's long-term success. No reputation, no business in the long run. So sullying their company's reputation is something they want to avoid at all costs. So how do you arm your sales rep? How do you arm them? How do you turn them into a champion for your cause? Well, you send your sales rep an email with the appropriate graph or should cost model appended or attached to it. And in that email, you can ask a simple question. Please explain why you're requesting an increase when your input costs are clearly lower than last year. And write the email in a straightforward, objective style so your rep can just simply forward it to the superiors. And in your comments, I've always found that asking questions is a better tactic than saying, hey, lower your price because your costs are down. But you say, geez, please explain why, or I'm wondering why, or it'd be interesting to understand your point of view. My experience is just doing this simple thing, arming your sales rep, gives them the ammunition they need, and very quickly this will move up the chain in your sales rep's organization. They'll get back to you within a day or two, and they'll want to cooperate. So let's summarize. Cost transparency favors the buyer over the seller. Mutually agreed to models build permanent transparency into price setting. Permanent transparency positions you to take supplier relations to the next level and frees you to pursue a key professional goal, which is creating a robust, sustainable, low-cost supply chain. So now we're going to go on to the fourth cornerstone. Fourth cornerstone was making your supply chain an enduring competitive advantage by taking supplier relationships to the next level. We call this going fishing with suppliers. So if you think of this picture with all these fish, there are small fish and big fish. I had a boss that once says, fish where the big fish are if you're going to go fishing. And so that brings up an interesting question. Where are the big fish? Where are the biggest cost savings opportunities when it comes to negotiating with suppliers, working with suppliers? It's interesting. In live presentations, we ask people, they put their hands up. We get great answers, consolidating freight, ordering in quantities that allow minimum setup times. But rarely do I hear the answer that I think is, in my experience over the years, is the best one. And I think the best cost savings opportunities are usually found inside your suppliers' organizations. It's the knowledge and ideas inside the heads of their managers or engineers, operations, and planning staff. When I look back at my career, sure, we could save money on freight, we could save money on lots of other ways, but the big money, the big idea, the big fish, the trophy fish, were always the ones we found inside the ideas. Were the ideas that came from our suppliers. Suppliers know a lot. They know a lot about the outside world. So they've probably been to your competitors' facilities, but even if they're not your competitors, they get to see how other people use their materials and how they process it. And so they can feed you back that information on how to reduce your scrap piles, for example, or how to change your specs so that you can run faster. The other thing they have is deep technical knowledge about their own products. They'll know how to thin the gauge on an extrusion, for example. They'll know what their materials can do and can't do. So that brings me to another story, a quick story. This is another true story, like the Green Giant one. This is when I worked for Bell Packaging. We made paint cans. We make paint cans and food cans, and we sold this paint can for $1.20. I'm from Toronto, so I'm Canadian, and we made cans in Canada for $1.20. We sold them for $1.20. This at the end of the 80s and early 90s is when we had NAFTA, the free trade agreement between the States and Canada. And the day after NAFTA came into effect, I think about 1991, the U.S. companies, the American companies came up and they were selling this same can for 86 cents. And we went nuts. We said, that's crazy. You can't sell a can. It cost us 90 cents for the steel. We couldn't possibly compete at 86. In fact, we were so sure the Americans were cheating that they were dumping that we went to the Canadian government and we said, hey, foul here, no fair. Americans aren't allowed to dump cans at less than the cost. They can't, they can't possibly make it for 80 and sell it for 86 cents and make any money. They're just getting rid of their excess cans, and we mortified to find out it wasn't true. We found out that in fact these cans were selling for 86 cents in the United States, and we didn't know what to do because we couldn't possibly compete. So CEO called me into his office and he said, we're going Chapter 11 in 3 months. We have to match competition. That meant we're losing money on every can we sold. Even if it was 91 or 92 cents, I guess we could have maybe tried to survive. But at 86 cents, we were literally paying more for the steel, let alone covering our overheads. So I went to a supplier. I went to our steel supplier and I said, hey, tell them the story. We're out of here in 3 months. We have no idea how this works. But this is kind of where the supplier's knowledge comes in, because they knew they knew how our competition in the States was doing it. What they understood was that when steel is made in steel mills, about 6% of the steel comes out as slightly flawed. It's called secondary material. It's got a piece of dirt in an inclusion, or it's got a wavy edge, or maybe a stain when it was being annealed. And there are about 14 reasons that steel is downgraded to secondary steel. And what the steel mills do, is they sell it to steel service centers because they don't want it in the prime market. They get rid of it at half price. So if we're paying $810 a ton, they sell it for $405 a ton to the steel service center, and the steel service center will cut it, slit it, take the prime parts out, and then resell it to their customers. So they really don't want it in the prime market because it'll undermine the pricing. Well, what had happened was that our U.S. competition had figured out that some of these deficiencies, for example, an annealing stain doesn't really affect the physical properties of the steel. And since you're putting a label around the paint can anyway, it doesn't matter. So our U.S. competitors had convinced their suppliers, their steel mills, to sell them some of the secondary material for half price. And of course they could then make the can and sell it for 86 cents because they're only paying half as much for the steel. So that's what our supplier did. They said, okay, they didn't want us to go under. We certainly didn't want to. So they diverted some of the secondary steel that they would normally sell to the Canadian service centers. They diverted to us, but only those specs that would work. So of the 14 kinds of secondary steel, only about 3 or 4 worked for the paint cans. But it was enough to allow us to make the can, sell it for 86 cents. In fact, we became so good, such a low-cost producer at making paint cans, that we acquired 2 companies afterwards. Within 3 years, we were a much bigger paint can supplier. So there's an example of where the supplier knew a lot about the outside world. They knew how our competition was making the paint cans, and they had deep technical knowledge about their own products. They knew about the secondaries, and they knew which ones would work for paint cans and which ones wouldn't. So there's this true story of how working with the suppliers not only saved us money, it actually saved our company. So working with your sales reps you should work with your sales reps to open the doors and expand the breadth of relationship with your suppliers. And your role is to be, as a supply chain professionals, to be a catalyst to make things happen. So you organize and share meetings, you set agendas and priorities, you flesh out new ideas, and you project manage. That's really important. You can have all the ideas in the world, you have people getting together, but unless you've got the discipline to choose which ideas you're going to work on and then manage those projects, nothing's really going to happen. So key skill that I think most supply chain professionals need to have is how not only to chair and organize meetings, but how to manage projects so that they come to a fruitful conclusion. And remember that cost savings ideas should flow both ways. It isn't the supplier just doing your bidding. You have to explore ideas that can help your suppliers too. So change your production. For example, changing the way you order can help them run longer runs, reduce their setups. Transportation, you can order in full pallets or full truckloads. Modifying specifications. Engineers tend to be very conservative. So maybe there's a way you can loosen a spec or two on the raw materials you're buying that would allow your supplier to run faster or with less scrap. And you can also share raw material cost data and modeling know-how with their purchasing departments. We always think of buyers and sellers. We think of supply chain professionals working with sales reps, But what about the purchasing departments in your sales reps organization? So your suppliers have purchasing departments. You can certainly share what you know about raw materials. So let's say you're buying from a distributor, and the distributor, you buy fasteners, for example, and so you try to, you know the price of steel's down, so fasteners should be lower. You go to your distributor, you say, I'm sorry, I can't do anything about it. Our supplier, the manufacturer, won't reduce the price. So, hey, show them the raw materials, show them the steel graph. Say, hey, I'll go with you. Let's work together to reduce your costs so that you can reduce our prices as well. So working with their purchasing departments is another thing you can do that helps ideas that flow both ways. Make it clear to your supplier's team that your team knows the law too, about how to save money and contribute good ideas to the process. So how do you achieve your negotiating goals? We're almost done. You achieve your negotiating goals by leveraging the 4 cornerstones for cost transparency you've just been introduced to. Just to repeat, it's the golden rule of negotiations: should cost modeling, converting sales reps to champions for your cause, and building a broad-based, mutually beneficial relationship with your preferred suppliers. Implementation definitely takes effort, but the rewards are well worth it. It puts you on the path to achieving 2 important professional goals. First, you can build a robust, sustainable, low-cost supply chain, which is your #1 job. And you can create an enduring competitive advantage for your organization. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. It's now time to ask the short questions. Here comes the first question. Just take a second to get there. Please get your mouse ready. Here comes the question. Please answer yes or no. Hang on, it's not coming. We have a technical problem here. Should we try this now?
There we go.
Sorry about that. Did you find this event a good use of your time? Please, I'll give you 10 seconds to answer. 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much. I'm going to close that. Here comes the second question. Would you like an extended pro-purchaser trial? An extended trial is a 60-day trial, a free trial rather than 30, and there's no commitment of any kind, no credit card required. Give you 5 more seconds. Great. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much for your attention, and thanks for answering those questions. That ends the presentation part of the webinar. It's now time for questions. Scott's been monitoring questions, so if any of you could stick around for those questions, please do so. If you can't stick around, don't forget to download any of those handouts that you want before you leave. So we're going to go on to the questions now. And Scott, please take over.
All right, fantastic. So to our audience, you've heard Rod's questions, and now you get a chance to pose some questions to him. So we're going to take the next 10 minutes or so as we wrap up on Q&A. And Rod, we've got about 18 questions submitted, so hopefully you're on your toes here.
Okay, so, I'll try. I'll get one second. My coffee's pulled. Let me finish it here.
Okay. All right.
Okay,
so,
I'm ready.
So the first question comes from Kelly. And Kelly asked, if I have a hard time getting insight into my supplier's costs, is that an indication they are not a good supply partner?
Well, so if you build a preliminary model, basic model, and you say, look, I know I'm missing things, but I know there's plastic in it or steel or wood, whatever, and they won't come back and help you correct the model, then they're probably the kind of supplier that does not like transparency. I talked about, there's 2 kinds of suppliers out there. The kind that like transparency, they tend to be low-cost producers. They tend to be very efficient. They don't really like hassling over price. They really want to just focus on the things they're good at. And they want to run a 3rd shift if they can. They want to become the most efficient producer there is, and they like that. So if those cost transparency tends to attract those kinds of suppliers. So if they're not open to it, sometimes it's cultural. So sometimes you have to work with them a little bit, and once they understand you're protecting their margin, that you're not trying to skinny them down on their profit. Once they understand that, they should want to cooperate. But if they still don't want to cooperate, then they're probably not low-cost producers. They're probably the kind of company that doesn't like transparency. And if you have the time and inclination, you might want to start looking for a supplier who embraces transparency, because that's usually a tell. That usually means that they're good at what they do, they're cost proud, and you're going to find it's easier to work with them than the ones who kind of throw, obfuscate, or whatever the word is, they throw clouds in the air, stuff like that.
And we're always looking for tells, right? Whether you play cards or otherwise. Great question, Kelly. Rod, next question comes from Christina, and this is kind of along the same lines here. She asked, what do you do if the supplier acknowledges the data and its accuracy, but he or she is going to hold the price because the market will bear it?
Well, that's a tough one. If they're a monopoly or duopoly, or it's really tough, isn't it? Because you probably have no other place to go. I still think it's worth it. What I used to do is I still run the model. I still do it. And I say, look, I know you're gouging here. You should really be reducing your price, whatever, 5 or 10%. This is just margin at my expense. And I guess you look them in the eye and say, are you here for a good time or a long time? And you start a long-term project to find out the supplier. You may have to look offshore, but you're just let the sales rep know how upset you are, that you know what they're doing. Remember, the sales rep's really keen on keeping the relationship with you intact, and they're going to be upset that you're upset. So they're going to relay that back to their management. It's a bit like arguing with the umpire. Maybe you might not win, that on the first pitch, but maybe the second and third pitch will be a little more lenient. So make sure the sales rep knows. Make sure they understand you know what they're doing. The sales rep's going to at least communicate your displeasure, and if that doesn't work, then start looking for a new supplier.
Fantastic. Great question, Christina. So we're going to wrap up the Q&A on two last questions, Rod. The first question, interestingly enough, comes from Jonathan Townsley, which is our next webinar presenter. Y'all both are such great procurement, supply chain thought leaders, but with a lot of expertise in procurement. So Jonathan, thanks for joining us here today. And Jonathan asked, aside from a cost reduction, what other significant value have you been able to negotiate for your organizations, Rod?
We're a one-trick pony. we just want to, there are all kinds of other things that are important, obviously, quality, kind of service, and I'm not minimizing those. They really are important. But what I've focused my career on was getting the best possible price, best value from a price point of view. Clearly, if you've got a good price and they never deliver on time, or they short ship half the time, or it's like you're not going to do business. But given that they deliver on time and their quality's what you expect it to be, then finding low-cost producers and getting the best value for your money is kind of what we do. So we need those other important factors to other people to help to do. Good supply chain professional figure that out. We just help really on the price negotiation.
Well, and I appreciate that question, Jonathan. It's a great segue to a question I want to pose to you as we wrap up Q&A here, Rod. So I've really enjoyed our prep work and getting to know you better and your experience and kind of your worldview. And I really I appreciate how you've approached this webinar from hey, you don't have to be a pro purchaser to benefit from what you've shared. And I really appreciate when folks take that approach. But with that said, I'd like for you to kind of explain where your data comes from as well as just a Reader's Digest overview of what Pro Purchaser is.
Okay, our data comes from three sources. We get that question all the time. First one are commodity markets, like the London Metal Exchange. Ironically, it's free and it's the best data you can get, because you see every day what a willing buyer and seller are transacting copper for, or aluminum, things like that. And that's about 15 or 20% of what we track. The second source is kind of deep experts, people who are in the business, brokers, distributors, who are actually buying and selling different raw materials. We get our nylon prices that way. A lot of the plastics are not traded on commodity exchanges, so you have to find people who actually know what the prices are. And then the third source is kind of published data. That could be trade journals, websites. Believe it or not, annual reports often have what the selling price, they'll explain where the prices are up and down. A lot of steel companies will report the prices that way. And so we combine all of those things and come up with a Pro Purchaser estimate. But one really important thing is there's a difference between being precise about the price and getting the direction right. If somebody tells you they know the actual price of steel that their supplier's paying, don't believe them, because nobody really knows. They're going to obfuscate that. When you buy steel, I used to buy it, there are all kinds of off-invoice discounts, volume discounts and things like that don't even show up on the invoice. And of course, everybody's going to pay different prices because the quantities they buy are different. The distance from the mill is different. What really matters is the direction of the pricing. So in that example with the steel, with the cans at the very beginning, the steel graph, it said it was $820 a ton. It doesn't really matter what your supplier really pays. Let's say he's paying $870 a ton. What that graph said is he's paying the same today as he was 17 months ago. So whatever you paid for your steel product 17 months ago is what you should be paying for today. So when you're negotiating, it's really the direction that counts. It's hard to be precise, but luckily you don't have to get the actual price right. You have to get the direction right, and that's relatively easy to do. In fact, there's one of the handouts is called the direction that counts, something like that. We were able to save money. Data comes from those sources, but again, don't get hung up on the accuracy. That's not as important as getting the direction right, because you can prove to your supplier that, hey, your costs are down. Whether they're down 17% or 16% really doesn't matter. They're down a lot, and that gives you the opening to go and negotiate a lower price.
Fantastic. And a little bit more information about Pro Purchaser, Rod. We appreciate the opportunity for our listeners and our audience members to take you up on the free trial. But if you had to put that in a 30-second nutshell, what is Pro Purchaser and what does it do?
Pro Purchaser is a tool I wish I would have had in the 80s when I was a purchaser. We didn't have the internet. It basically is a quick way to double check what your supplier is saying. It's really hard. I mean, purchasing is a really busy job. You have telephone in each year, production plans change. If you didn't like being busy, you wouldn't be in the supply chain. It goes up and the cost of plastics up, or wood, or whatever. You need a quick way to do that, and that's the tool. Once the internet came along, at the end of the 90s, in fact, we launched in 2001, to quickly inform people. Like in 20 seconds, you can figure out whether importantly, when you don't hear from the supplier for 6 months, maybe it's a good idea to go and check to see if in fact his raw material costs are down, like we saw, say, with the plastic, and give them a call and say, be proactive. Say, geez, how come we didn't lower the price? So in a nutshell, that's what we do. We keep our members on top of what's happening to their suppliers' costs so they can take appropriate action. We don't negotiate. We don't tell them what they should be paying. What we do is we give them kind of arrows to put in their quiver so they can go and do a little better when they actually start hunting.
Fantastic. Well, really have appreciated your perspective here today, Rod. Of course, I know you welcome questions after the fact. We couldn't get all the questions today, which is becoming routine, but that typically means that our folks appreciate the perspective you've shared. So we do want to wrap up on a couple of final moments. And again, thanks, our final announcements. Thanks to Kelly and Christina and Jonathan for great questions. So first off, we want to make sure that our audience is aware of the IFR Transport, EFT, 3PL, and Supply Chain Summit coming here to Atlanta next week. They're bringing some of the biggest industry names right here to the Supply Chain City for 3 days of thought leadership and executive level networking. So we're pleased to be not only serving as a media partner for EFT, but we're going to be broadcasting live from the event. Courtesy of our friends over at Becker Logistics. You can visit them at beckerlogistics.com. I believe registration is still open. You can check that out at EFT.com, or of course, click on the hyperlink we'll have on the deck that goes out, or shoot us a note. We'll get you more information. Secondly, we're pleased to serve as a media partner for the upcoming 2019 SCAC AIAG Supply Chain and Quality Conference. You know we're in supply chain and we love our acronyms. So AIAG stands for the Automotive Industry Action Group. SCAC is the South Carolina Automotive Council. So as you might imagine, this conference in September in beautiful North Charleston, South Carolina, is going to be focused on the world of automotive. We've got a couple of sponsors for our live broadcast there. It is an open event. They're expecting about 250 folks from across the world of automotive to be there in Charleston. And shoot us a note if you're interested in joining us, or of course, check out that hyperlink we'll have on the deck. Finally, gosh, lots of webinars coming up. We've got Jonathan Townsley, as we mentioned, on June 19th, who will also be talking about procurement best practices. Chuck Baker is going to join us on July 23rd, talking about a book that he has released a few years ago. We've got upcoming podcasts, including our Today in Manufacturing series, which continues on with the Georgia Manufacturing Alliance. We're going out to a Fastenal distribution center in West Atlanta. And if you're not familiar with the Fastenal story and how they were Amazon before Amazon got cool, then you're going to want to join us on June 21st as we broadcast a couple of shows, including their story on Supply Chain Now Radio. And you can learn more about that series, our manufacturing focus series, at todayinmanufacturing.com. Okay, so check out our website for upcoming webinars, podcasts, events. If there's anything we can do for you, shoot us a note to scott@supplychainnowradio.com. Rod, before we conclude today's session, any final thoughts on your end?
Well, first of all, thank you again for this invitation, Scott. I really do appreciate it. And again, thanks to everybody for making time. And we know it's your busy day to listen to what we have to say. I guess in summary, transparency is your friend. If you're a procurement professional, think of transparency as your friend. It favors the buyers, but it's still fair to both parties. It eliminates price creep, which is huge. It's hard to do that any other way. And it forces the suppliers to play fair. They're only going to come to you in future. They know you're watching, so if they've got justified, supportable reasons to raise prices, okay, they'll come to you. And again, it attracts the best suppliers. So you kind of have your cake and eat it too. You get better pricing, you get the best suppliers, and you get the best supply chain. So that's your friend. So transparency is your best friend. How's that for a final thought?
No, absolutely. Very timely, and it's neat to see the generation moving into the workforce now demanding it in ways that we haven't seen before. So I think great positive trends. As we wrap up today, we want to give a big thank you, high five, to Rod Sherkin with ProPurchaser.com. Again, Rod, really enjoyed learning more about you and your worldview as we prep for this webinar. Thanks for joining us here today. I know you keynote across the country, or I should say across the continent, so appreciate you carving some time out and sharing your perspective here today. Of course, a big special thanks to our sponsors, Apex Atlanta and Talent Stream. Big thank you to our audience for participating. We appreciate all the great questions. On behalf of Supply Chain Now Radio, this is Scott Luton concluding today's episode. We hope to reconnect with you again real soon. Have a great week, everybody.